Right, welcome everyone to the Active Inference Institute. This is week one of running through cohort 7. We're starting with chapter 6 of the textbook. This is beginning the second half of the textbook. As we know, in the first half, we're covering a lot of the fundamentals of active inference. We started with an introductory chapter, environments, looking at a lot of basic fundamental principles behind ideas regarding behavior of sentience, organisms, and so on. We're looking at neural process theories, and so how is it that neuronal populations perhaps function in a way that leads to different kinds of inferential processes, such that beings kind of get around the world, they update their beliefs, they make particular decisions and kind of weight those decisions amongst one another. They have things like attention. We've been introduced to terms like precision modulation that in the literature gets related to the idea of something like neurotransmitters and transmission, and a variety of other topics that you can have a look at. We tend to publish these textbook reading chapters, like these sessions that we do, and so you can review those on YouTube under the Active Inference Institute channel. And then we'll start quickly here. This is the cohort for anyone who's new. This is the cohort 7 page of the Coda. So we use Coda as kind of like this open platform and forum for anyone who's not familiar with it. You can actually just go in here, and depending on as long as you've registered for the textbook, you should be able to edit particular things. You can place there are pages for communications. We have pages that involve different equations, figures that are within the textbook for quick lookup and reference, being able to index them to a natural language description of what each of them are, which has been incredibly helpful for people to just rather than being stuck within a single chapter, it helps to get a broader holistic sense of what's going on in the textbook. And then let's see, this course, yeah, questions. These are sort of major ongoing questions. This is a kind of an overview. This is not specific to any particular cohort, right? And so that allows for this kind of nestedness of, inter-cohort communication and kind of leaving each other in a stigmergic fashion notes for one another, different things that people have been contending with in their minds, like what is surprise minimization? What are these things like the high road and the low road to active inference that we get introduced to in chapters 2 and 3? Why are we phrasing things this way, all the way down to deeper, a lot of topics in this book are kind of thought-provoking for a lot of people. It brings up a lot of questions about what is consciousness and what is life, and panpsychism, and all kinds of interesting kind of additional topics that we may not cover directly in the textbook group, but it kind of begs the question for a lot of people, some of these things. So it's a very interesting, useful kind of historical archive almost of questions about and then sectioned into each chapter, so that way you can kind of see what else is going on in other people's minds and thoughts. So we previously were running a math learning group. I believe it's still ongoing, with someone who goes by the alias Octopus, but they're very smart, and this has been very useful to a lot of people, because a lot of people are coming into active inference not necessarily having a background in mathematics. They don't necessarily have an intuitive sense of matrix operations, or what a Taylor series approximation is, and things like that. So it's very useful to have kind of these sources that perhaps kind of spring up around the textbook without being confined to just the textbook itself. So we have plenty of other things. We have some resources regarding telling you about PyMDP I mentioned earlier. There's coding documentation. So it's a very kind of open science environment where this is not a deep hierarchical structure that we have, right? So a lot of people contribute what they want to contribute, and they kind of hope to get out of it what they put into it, and vice versa. And yeah, so I would say that's a decent introduction. And then there's also the onboarding page. I'll also mention that quickly, where you can kind of gives you overview of what's going on in the coda, and then we can also get to like accessing the textbook itself. I want to mention that. Like so the textbook is freely available now. As Daniel mentioned earlier, it's been around for like nearly 3 years now. So already to this day, like there's been an immense amount of research that's been published since then. I would say that many of the core principles, ideas, even equations in the textbook are still highly relevant today. That's part of the utility of continuing to go over the textbook rather than treating it as if it were something that's, already obsolete. But then that said, I mean, for anyone who's come here because they saw Friston's Pixels to Planning paper and renormalization, generative models, and all the interesting things that have come out much more recently, that you won't find them in this textbook. You will find many of the kind of guiding principles that went into the design of those models, however. So once again, like, if there should be a central node for learning active inference, I personally would argue that it should still be the textbook, probably. So to move on from there, so yeah, we're looking at chapter 6 today. Um, uh, Normally I provide a very long summary, sometimes too long at the beginning of these sessions whenever I'm the one leading the session. I'll try to keep it a little bit shorter, especially because like in the same way that chapter 1 was an introduction to active inference, the reason why we split things up this way is in part because when you start chapter 6, it's actually like this is officially the second half of the book, in the sense of it kind of has its own foci that it looks at. So the second half of the book is going to be much more centered on modeling and directly modeling active inference agents and environments and so on, as opposed to many of the like kind of natural language descriptions of core concepts. You'll still find some in the second half of the textbook, so it's worth reading the whole textbook, whether you're interested in cognitive modeling or you're interested in the philosophy or phenomenology of mind. So I guess I'll get into it then with chapter 6. This is a very general kind of chapter opposed to the rest of the book, and maybe aside from chapter 10, which is just a broad overview of a variety of disciplines and how they relate to active inference. So for anyone who's also new to active inference, actually jumping to the end of the book, chapter 10, where we suddenly get to see a clearer picture of how a variety of fields from like psychology, study of emotion and affect, to robotics and cybernetics and even economic theory all have their own kind of interesting interrelationships with active inference. Like that's actually at the end of the book. So jump there if you're coming from maybe a different field and want to see how this relates to your own field. Chapter 6 is a recipe for designing active inference models. And so this is really just kind of providing you something like a recipe, or the second half of the book can be read almost like a cookbook, in the sense of let's decide on just a couple of exemplar models that could be used in particular scenarios. And then from there, what are their core elements? And then yet again, from there, you can start to figure out how to adapt them to your particular use case or phenomena of interest. So with chapter 6, they tried to boil it down to something like a simple 4-step recipe. It's one of the relatively shorter chapters in the book. It's like an introduction to the second half. I do want to point out to everyone this, which is I've always found this rather interesting. Unlike many other approaches to computational neuroscience, the challenge is not to emulate a brain piece by piece, but to find the generative model that describes the problem the brain is trying to solve. Once the problem is appropriately formalized in terms of a generative model, the solution to the problem emerges under active inference with accompanying predictions about brains and minds. So you can kind of see how, as opposed to some sense of let's model some several billion neuron kind of brain model. This is more about trying to model a system. For anyone who's read the first half of the book, you've already become familiar with the notion of a Markov blanket. And so it's kind of like, can you identify a particular system of interest? It could be a person, it could be just a particular region or substrate in the brain. It could be an entire like society and having nested Markov blankets. But the idea is that the Markov blanket allows us to sort of delimit the particular thing or system that we're trying to model and understand. And so whenever it comes to like modeling, let's say like a artificial or theoretical person who has a brain, the idea would be not so much that you need to model every single facet of them. You're actually modeling just what is of interest, what holds well together, what can be tested, what has different kinds of physiological substrates and can be traced back to neurobiology. So we make sure we're not running too far off into artifice land. And so very typical modeling, concerns and problems that are found in data science or even economics or machine learning. Like essentially, how do we model something and how do we do it in a way that is generalizable such that it can extend beyond itself? It's like I've created an agent. It can be in this situation. It can be in that situation. But then also we needed to hold to realism, right? And being able to trace it back to the literature and testing, refining, going back and forth, and so on. So that's kind of what chapter 6 is trying to set us up for. We're just looking at what does it make sense to model. So that's why I've always found this interesting. We're looking for a generative model that in a sense represents sort of the mind. If I keep going with this artificial person that we're modeling, to use an example of that, then we're looking for the generative model that they kind of hold. Say we model a person who is engaging in a behavioral task, for example, then what is the model that they would be using, for that? If the task is to play some kind of card game, then do we necessarily need to model a variety of like other facets of that? Do they have to be able to feel hungry or not, or is that not really relevant to the particular situation that we were modeling? And it's there that's what this chapter centers around, in the sense of how do we choose what to include in our model, and starting with step one, what direction should we go in trying to decide what the model should be? Which system are you modeling, right? So I've kind of loosely already covered the sense of that. We see this may not be as simple as it seems. It rests on the identification of the boundaries, i.e. Markov blanket of that system. And it might be useful, actually, now that I do have the coda, it would be useful to have a look real quick. This is a classic figure. Um,
Wait, move the thank you.
oh yeah. Sorry, I'm not sure what it looks like on my
Just
screen.
the zoom windows, I believe, the vertical and the horizontal bar
Yeah.
are grayed out, but it looks good now. Thank you.
Okay. I see. So in this case, whenever we're modeling a system of interest, right, it's kind of like on the left here, this could represent our environment, and then on the right, this could represent our agent. The terminology is for an agent, that's the generative model, and then for the environment, it's the generative process. Um, I won't say that those terms are necessarily arbitrarily chosen, but it can, for some people who are new, using the word generative very frequently, it might be a little confusing at first. So I'll just say that for the agent, it's usually the agent that we are interested in modeling. And in one way of phrasing it, someone else has phrased it this way. I believe it was Mark Soames who's worked a lot with Karl Friston. It's kind of like we're modeling a system of interest, that being our agent, or and then the environment is kind of like the not system. Sounds very informal or even colloquial, but the sense is not your agent in this situation, being able to draw that kind of defining line. And then what is it that actually allows your agent to interface with this environment or survive within it, if that's the kind of paradigm that you're looking at, or to interact with it in some kind of way. And so it's here where the agent commits actions that then affect the environment. It's not a direct one-to-one relationship. It's kind of like we have this sort of vicarious relationship between the two, where an agent commits an action, which becomes kind of metaphorically an observation for the environment. And then the environment takes that observation and itself then emits a new, it's as if it's acting, but that action becomes an observation for the agent. So there's this kind of reciprocal process occurring over the course of what could be conceptualized as an action perception loop, where an agent receives through their sensory states an observation, that's perception. And then through action, they may select an action or another term policy that they then commit, which affects the environment. And of course, this can be formalized in a very discrete bit, loop by loop way, like over T time steps or over, T time steps within S trials or simulations. But in terms of sort of the literature and the actual the findings, we tend to view these things as very rapid, actually continuous processes, right? And in terms of like a neural process theory, so there's certainly different ways to look at it. And then back to the textbook. Other questions: what is the most appropriate form for the generative model? What should it be? What should it look like? Will be introduced in chapter 7 to discrete state space models. The POMDP, or partially observable Markov decision-making process, is sort of one of the exemplar models for discrete state spaces. Discrete state space, for some people who are unfamiliar, as opposed to it being like a continuous, we're looking at values that are not continuously valued in the sense of like on a range of 0 to 1, you could have 0.111115, like not that. It's instead it's discrete state space. So maybe there are three colors: red, blue, and green. It'd be that kind of setting. And that's very useful whenever it comes to thinking of situations where maybe an agent has discrete options. It eats the food, it does not eat the food, it moves left or it moves right, and so on. And then how do you set up the model? So that's looking at things like varying time scales. You have hierarchical models and agents, and so on. And then how to set up the generative process, which is essentially the environment, the not agent, the not system. Um, and I want to briefly note that since someone mentioned earlier that they're in their own environment where they're being confronted with reinforcement learning and how that's being carried out to do cognitive modeling, which is certainly a fair approach, and it's being done, and it's very interesting. It's starting to be done in the social sciences as well, which is sort of my personal like deeper background. And then that said, there's still a lot of kind of missing theoretical or cognitive components to that. So actually, it was last year that a talk that I gave where I kind of made the case that it's actually active inference that supplies a lot of the missing sort of empirical and well thought out sort of being able to trace all of these components of a POMTP actually back to the neurobiology and being able to say what each of these parameters is. And then in addition to that, the sort of exploration exploitation problem in expected free energy, which kind of the quote in the textbook is that it gets naturally resolved or balanced through active inference, as opposed to certain kinds of aspects of reinforcement learning where admittedly some of the approaches have been kind of arbitrary, such as, oh, the agent does something random with probability 0.1, epsilon greedy kind of, for anyone who's familiar with that language. So all this is to say, I think active inference personally fills in a lot of spaces that have yet to be really filled in or fully formalized within the reinforcement learning paradigm for cognitive modeling. It's like from chapter 1 in active inference, like we already have a very large normative framework here that we can begin to apply and test. So um, I didn't even need to go to the figures. It's already here. Um, I think that we're already over halfway through the meeting, so I will start to just open it up now for anyone who has any kind of questions or thoughts or curiosities. This is just week 1, so I don't think there's any strong imperative to get too deep too quickly. So yeah, anyone who wants to speak, please go for it, or they have a certain part of the textbook they want me to jump to and we could look at it together. Yeah.
Do you
Yeah,
have you have a specific example for the first cartoon figure you showed, the figure 6.1? Maybe something on hand that's very particular.
Hmm. So this is a very, yeah, sure. No, and that's a good question. So this is a very general kind of notion in active inference. Actually, as far as the figure goes, like the caption, action perception loop between an adaptive system and the environment. So this is kind of just a way of understanding, like, our agent has its own internal states, its own beliefs, what it's trying to infer, and then it uses those in a sense. Maybe use sounds a little too uh, that has its own nuance to it, but it's as if it those beliefs are being used to figure out what actions to take. That's what's represented here in the active states, and those are what influence the environment. So I mean, chapter 7, after this, we'll get into discrete state space models, so POMDPs. There's an example of like a T maze where it's a very kind of classic, simple experiment where there's like a mouse and it has to navigate a T maze, meaning there are two arms in the maze. It can go left or it can go right. And then one of those arms will have, what we assume to be like cheese, like the essentially the reward that the agent seeks or wants or prefers. And then in the other arm will be, either something innocuous, or it'll be like a shock or something negative, something the agent does not want, the mouse does not want. And so the agent has to kind of choose which way to go. So what's going on within that agent is that it begins to model its environment, in its beliefs. And so it has beliefs about where it thinks the cheese is. Is it on the left or is it on the right? And as more trials continue, assuming that agent it has different kinds of adaptive capacities, which in reality, probably yes, in terms of modeling, that's kind of up to the modeler to do their own research on how to kind of evidentially back up the assumptions they're making when they set up their model. But that would be the sense, like so we have the mouse to the right. They have a belief about where the cheese is. It's on the left or the right, so they choose to move as an action left or right. And then by moving left or right, that moves them through their environment, and they get to now see the new observations of having gone left or right. And those observations are taken in by the sensorium of the agent. It could be a visual modality, so they see the cheese or not, or it could be a more, sense, touch or feeling, physical touch kind of modality. And so it's maybe, unfortunately, it's the shock, and so they feel that, and that comes back to the agent. So the point is that the agent has beliefs about what's going on. They act. Those actions then elicit new observations from the environment that the agent then senses, and it updates its belief. Was that helpful?
Yeah, I think so. I'm just so the generative model is how the agent believes the data is creative, and the generative process is how the data is actually created. Um, and I'm failing to be very creative here, and I apologize for maybe this next example, but um, if I consider myself as the agent, maybe my beliefs are that if I cut down on the amount of coffee I drink per week, I will get better sleep. The process is actually going to be myself because I'm going to actively cut down on the amount of coffee I drink during the week, and my body is going to give me information about whether I actually sleep well or not. Um, is that kind of it's the thing that came to my head right now, but I wonder if that's maybe okay. Now,
It's it's a really good analogy, actually. I mean, in the sense of, whenever it comes to like learning difficult material, it's often useful to just make it familiar, right? Like actually make it familiar quick from the beginning, because then you can kind of ease into the concepts. And that's a really good example in the sense that, you know, you kind of have a belief or a hypothesis, let's say, about what kind of action you should take or could take to change, you know, the observations that'll be elicited from your environment towards something that you prefer or want, you know, such as, oh, I want to drink less caffeine, I will be, you know, healthier. And then that's a solid insight regarding like, oh, my body is actually the process, right?
Yeah.
And it brings us back to the sense of a Markov blanket. If we were to model that, then it's in a sense, yeah, it's your own. So, you know, whenever it comes to the sensorium, to having sensory receptors, and this is throughout a lot of the neuroscience literature. This is not specific to a lot of this isn't specific to active inference entirely. But in neuroscience, you know, you can have interoceptive modalities where you are sensing things from within your own body. And so as far as having a generative model and beliefs, it's as if like I actually have to model my own body to understand the physiological symptoms, or well, symptoms is a harsh word, but signals that arise from it, right? So actually that's a really good example, and I think it's a good heuristic. And then sorry, Daniel, you had your hand, and then Stephen.
Yeah, two short comments on this. First off, we see all these examples and kind of become familiar with mapping diagrams and graphics and formalisms and the analytical basis of active inference to situations. So that's exactly what chapter 6 is about, giving one recipe for how do you go from being like, I care about self-driving cars, or I care about this person in this situation, or myself in this situation, to be like, what's an observation? What is an action? What is an internal state? Like that is exactly what happens. And then also just an important note is some people, especially more recently, describe generative model from the modeler's perspective to reflect the total situational understanding of all of the probabilistic relationships in the model that's being constructed. And fewer people use generative process nowadays. But when you get into the example, and we will, then whether you call it one thing or another in English or another language, there is a distinction between like, this is the agent's beliefs about what happens if they hit the light switch. And then here's what actually happens when the agent hits the light switch. So they are separate variables, and there can be veridical or off kilter beliefs about consequences of actions or what observations map to. So they're separate variables. It's just note that in more recent work, generative model sometimes is used a little bit more totalistically, whereas in the textbook, it's used to cleanly separate the generative model of the agent being the total description of the agent to the generative process, which is like the environment niche that generates observations and accepts the actions of the agent.
Awesome. Thanks, Daniel. I just quickly jumped to this figure just to kind of illustrate they themselves are aware of it in the textbook. It's like here is the sort of here's the subjective model that we assume like maybe an agent has. And then that said, we are the modelers. And so it's a very meta sort of perspective, but it's very worthwhile taking into account. It relates back to what I said, like, oh, and machine learning, data science, reinforcement learning, et cetera. It's like we kind of are making our own deliberate decisions regarding how we're modeling sort of the thing in the first place. So being able to maintain that sort of meta level perspective, which is ultimately what's going to actually feed into just producing better research and being able to make that level of observation and comparison. Anyway, so Stephen, yeah, go for it.
Yeah, I'd like to nail down these concepts if I can from my perspective, and using like controlled eye movements as an example, where you have six eye muscles that have to be controlled to move the eye. So the default control of those eye muscles would be the subjective model. Is that right? And so like if I'm gonna if I have a target to move to, a planned movement, I have to move the eyes. send a motor signal to the eye muscles, the eye moves. But if it doesn't reach the target, if there's an error, let's say a visual error, I don't see that represented in the figure you showed, but I'm assuming there's a way of there's a obviously there are equations to incorporate that, and then the motor command gets updated somehow to compensate for the default signal, which wasn't correct.
Yes, I wanted to see if I could find it, and I wasn't necessarily prepped for it for this particular session, but there are various examples, not many, but there are at least a few examples of sort of like a ISACOD paradigm and recreating those kinds of simulations in active inference. So yeah, it's kind of like so you're modeling your agent. In this case, they have eyes, and so they're probably going to have some kind of control mechanism of available to them that you sort of bake into the agent and the model. Um, so I'll return back to where we were.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like, the agent may have their beliefs in the sense of like maybe they have a belief about where they should look or if they should look somewhere in particular.
Yeah. So sorry. So the word belief,
Yeah.
I can just replace the word uh, default command, or
The belief is the state of any Bayesian parameter, especially an internal cognitive one or a perceptual one at a given time. So like the actuality of the process's state that
yeah.
gives rise to given visual input is the orientation of the eye. And then there's a belief that we can say about what would I see if I were to go there. And that is where we can continue on, Andrew. But I can add more about the iSaccade because this is a really important key. It's kind of like a Drosophila situation for understanding perception and action.
Thank you. Keep going.
Yeah, no, definitely. Thanks, Daniel. It's very helpful. And yeah, I probably should have clarified that. So yeah, another term is like this sense of hidden states or hidden latent states of the environment. So it's as if the agent is kind of modeling that in their mind, and so that's where I'm using the word beliefs, and that's how that arises. And then from there then to active states. This is kind of like these are the sort of action affordances that are available to the agent of what they can do. So it's kind of like with the agent, there will be these dynamics that, maybe they choose to do something and the dynamics play out kind of in the previous example that I think it was Joe who gave regarding like, oh, my body is the environment in this case in a certain way. It's kind of like, oh, well, whenever I choose to move my eyes, like actually, I can't change my physiology in a click of my fingers. Instead, it's that I'm making decisions that I'm subject to kind of the environmental limitations of my eyes and their motor dynamics and what they're capable of doing and how they're connected to, and having retina and so on. So it's here in active states that like I actually choose something and then it happens, right? And that's sort of this vicarious connection that I have with the environment around me. It's kind of like I have beliefs, I act on those beliefs, and then by acting, it's moving my eyes, and then from moving my eyes, that brings about new observations for me from the environment around me.
Also, just to the vision example, it's it's not a simple single layer model. So just four phenomena that are actually incredible entry points for understanding how our qualia is generated, not recognized only, but clarity in vision around the periphery, as well as color, where the density of receptors is low, um, the absence of a blind spot, and the absence of a motor, outside of just in standard vision, and the saccade being not attended to. Those are actually all very important phenomena so that reflect that the primary sensory input to the retina is not what is being experienced as seen. So it's like both the strength and the weakness of entering into a more complex cognitive phenomena. It has a lot more tangibility and like first person experiential nature and our familiarity with it. And yet you may need to invoke several nested models or interacting subsystems, but that is the work of cognitive accounting for something like cicading. It's just that like the simple models that don't have attentional modulation are not going to capture that element of the cicade, but they can be layered in.
Hello. So I once heard Daniel use the term OODA loop. And so I see observation, I see action. So my understanding would be the orientation would be the generative model, and the decision would be the policy selection, right?
Basically, yes, OODA, observe, orient, decide, act, is like a procedural parsing of this same system of interest. Here, there's a simultaneous flow happening across all the states, and there's a degree of modular freedom in which procedural order, or if a procedural order is even used to describe it. But yes, observation comes in and is recognized where it intersects with the prior. That's like observation and orientation. Then there's policy inference, which is like decision. And then there's action selection, which is action.
Okay, so that was a setup. So my real question is, so I was thinking that the generative model would be part of the internal states, and so would the policy selection, but it sounds like maybe the policy selection is actually the active states.
Policy inference in terms of beliefs about policy, beliefs about the consequences of action, evaluation of policies in terms of their epistemic and pragmatic value. Those are beliefs that are internal states. Action on the interface is like the selected actual action because it's the active state that's exposed to the environment.
Okay, so then would you say both the generative model and the policy selection are part of the internal states?
As per a little earlier, generative model is used to in this textbook to describe the blanket states and the internal states of the agent. The generative model is the joint distribution of sense, internal, and action that describes the agent totally. That's the generative model. And then internal states are the parameters or beliefs of whatever structure that are not on the interface. So anything that's insulated from the environment directly is internal states, and that can include nesting and metacognition and so on. And the blanket states composing that action and the sense, for the actual action going out and the actual observation getting spiked in.
Yeah, just to kind of second Daniel, I mean, for anyone who's familiar with the sort of just programming loops, I suppose, that would be a typical one way you could do it is often we use the phrase action perception loop, but more simulations I've seen actually do more of a perception action loop, like they're the other way around. So the agent I guess to put it in terms of like an OODA loop in a certain way, it'd be kind of like observe as the agent receives an observation, and then orient could be to take that information into account to update your beliefs or these internal states that I stated, and then decide relates to policy inference. So in fact, you almost should view state inference and policy inference as kind of like two distinct processes. Both of them involve minimizing free energy in different ways. So to decide in a certain sense is like, oh, should I do X or Y? Well, let's back up a second, go back to orient. Well, what did I just see? And then back up before that, what observation was elicited to me that I observed, right? So it's kind of like I take in an observation, I update my beliefs in terms of internal states, Then I update my beliefs about policies or actions. That's kind of the decide, and then after that, act is to actually carry out the action, right? You could theoretically have an agent who can infer states, and then after that uses that information to infer policies, but then in the final stage they can't act because, I don't know, something happened, or something silly like the modeler just left out that line of code to allow them to act on their belief about action. So yeah, there's state inference and there's policy inference, and there are a lot of components within the agent that, they relate the two. They're not entirely divorced processes, but in a sense they happen separately. And I know that there's a lot of conversation going on in the chat, but I could briefly speak on, and Daniel has answered the questions very well, but there's a question: is the generative model modeling the prior distribution, or are we learning the parameters like mean and variance of the distribution? In a sense, we could say both, depending on how you set up the model. And so a lot of the kind of general model parameters, I pulled this up earlier, which can be slightly overwhelming when you're not given any kind of context as to what it is, but this appears earlier in the textbook, and then it's kind of the centerpiece of chapter 7 later. But this is sort of a POMDP, which an architecture like this would look very similar for a POMDP in reinforcement learning. Maybe some particular pieces are not shown in this diagram that maybe sets it apart, but in certain ways it's very similar to just a standard POMDP. And so, like, for A, that's kind of like, so the A matrix is like your likelihood. It's very much related to just a general sense of perception. You take in observations and you infer states. So O, observations conditioned on variety of different beliefs you could have, right? And then B is state transitions, and that's what adds a temporal dimension to these models, in the sense of you now have an agent who has a sense of what could happen next. And so that kind of counterfactual space is now available to them to have beliefs about, oh, if I'm hungry and then I choose an action to eat this food, then I will no longer be hungry. Like, that can be a belief you hold, and you could potentially have a very high probability of that belief, as opposed to other combinations of the distinct states or factors within that sort of state space. C would be it's C, D, and E. E is left out from this diagram, aside from being present within G. But C is your prior over observations. And so that's an interesting one, because it's often framed as preferences, in the sense of, this is what I want to see. And so many models in active inference are modeled in such a way that you could learn the C. It could be updated over time by updating it using a free energy minimization rule that allows you to, like, kind of learn sort of a hyperparameter on C. So in the sense of, like, oh, I could learn to want something different than what I currently want, or I could learn to want an additional thing in addition to what I already want. So that's possible. Or you can leave it static. A lot of people do that whenever it comes to behavioral tasks, in the sense of, oh, you assume during the course of a trial someone's not going to dramatically change what they want in their life or in their physiology or something. So it can be left static. So that's prior. D is the prior over states. So as Daniel mentioned earlier, like, the three most general components of getting started with constructing just about any model are states, observations, and actions. Once you figured those out, then it's really just choosing what's the appropriate model to relate those three different things. And so that's what we get in the case of a discrete state space POMDP. Like, A relates observations and states, B relates states temporally plus along with actions. Then C is your prior over observation, D prior over states, G, that's just your expected free energy term, which so that's using your prior beliefs about observations and actions here to figure out what policy to take. And of course, there are breakdowns of this, functionally, but that's the general sense. So as opposed to getting overwhelmed, it's really everything boils back down to what are the states, observations, and actions of your model. And I have just noticed the time, and we're nearly out. So, um, I, Daniel, I don't know if you have any kind of end notes or final words you want to throw out there, or
Yeah. Chapter 6 is like the practical entry point. Chapter 1 and also chapter 10 deal more with the theoretical aspects of active inference, but before or after reading those, if you're like, how do we actually do cognitive modeling? That's what chapter 6 is, one attempt and one proposal for. And the questions that are asked in chapter 6 about how do you go from a system of interest on through procedurally constructing a model, it's there. Not every single nook and cranny is there, but there, plus asking in the Institute Discord and colleagues and looking at papers and code bases, it is there. So, like, for those who can code or prompt generative AI or just are getting a first pass on this application, it rounds out a lot of like the theoretical discussions, some of which may just be perennially open, but it is really applicable. So I hope that whether you're gonna stay at this time slot or a different time slot, or just however you jump around the textbook and wherever you're at in terms of like looking for more philosophical exploration to the code implementations and actually doing empirical inquiry, 6 is a good chapter. And write your questions in the coda if you have them, or email them if you don't know where to put it, or just put it anywhere. And welcome to the next phase of activity for the textbook group. And we'll have chill discussions at this time weekly. Yeah, exactly. Great. And go through the prior asked questions and add some, and where you have uncertainties, you do a tremendous service by commenting and writing.
Hey, sorry, Daniel. My apologies for coming late. Is there a particular section that we're focused on each week, or what would be the best way to prepare for next week?
Yeah, if you look at the cohort 7 and cohort 8 live meeting pages, it'll have like the exact contents of each discussion. So yeah, Andrew's going to it. So here's where we're today at 23 UTC. Next week at this exact time slot, cohort 8 is going to be discussing chapter 1. And then just everyone's been added to the calendar events, and just check which week or time. But the two cohorts alternate early and late time slots, but the two time slots stay the same every week. So 7 days from now, it'll be chapter 1 discussion. 2 weeks from now at this time slot, we'll be back in cohort 7 discussing chapter 7. So, but you can read and enjoy and write questions and add discourse to any section. So doing and contributing anything, don't be limited to what's on the agenda, but this just sets a pace, because we could spend 2 minutes on each chapter, or we could spend 2 months on each chapter. So it just keeps a pace rolling and gives time zone accessibility. But there's people who don't even join the live meetings, and they're just looking to contribute asynchronously or on their own research. So like however it looks like for you to be learning and applying it, go for it. And as Andrew said, like the 22 textbook is kind of a milestone work. So it's a good place to ground and connecting it to specific figures, equations, quotes, that gives you a shared touch point with other people as well, as opposed to just free floating questions, which also can be critically important. It's just that they're sometimes coming out of left field from other people's view. So
That's
okay.
great. Thank you.
Thank you. Farewell. And I'll upload the recording as well. So if you ever don't make it or you want to look at the prior cohorts and times, just check out the recordings. Okay. Farewell. Bye.